Hi, this time we are going to study about how human motions are formulated in terms of muscle activation and its control. So remember in this course, we learned how we can analyze human motion in terms of dynamics and control. And then so far we have learned about the basic dynamics and specifically the inverse dynamics, the frequently used biomechanical skills to analyze human motion. And for chapter 2, without significant involvement of active control, we learn how the dynamics framework could explain the key dynamic characteristics of locomotion, like walking. So, simple inverted pendulum activated by simply gravity, the passive walker, or very simple push-up impulse actuated walking model has been studied, and based on that, we learned much about the basics of energetics and periodicity, etc. And also, recently we learned how the spring mechanics can very well represent the force and motion relationship of the center of mass. So it seems like, F equals ma could pretty much well explain the human motion in terms of force and motion relationship. However, the human motions are not that simple. Those are like a very complicated, multi-sensory, sensory informations are collected from the motion, and those multiple informations are integrated, and based on that there are control mechanisms are involved. It's pretty complicated structure. So in this chapter 3, we are going to briefly study how control related terms such as muscle activations, sensory feedbacks are used to describe or understand human movement. Specifically in chapter 3.1, we are going to focus on how muscle, the biological actuators, are generating forces and how we can formulate them and integrate to our dynamic equation to understand human motion. So the later in detail for chapter 3.1, we are going to I'm going to introduce briefly about how muscle activations are take the role for human motion, and we are going to study the contraction mechanism of the muscles and its formulation. The very famous Hills model is what we are going to study. Once we could mathematically formulate the muscle forces, then the next step is how we can implement it to the equations of motion, what we have studied so far up to chapter 2 to describe human motion or understand human motion. So two examples for muscle activation involved model like a jumping and throwing, pretty much based on the Alexander's paper, are going to delivered in this chapter. Okay, let's briefly review again how muscle activation of human motions are generated. Um, we know that the human locomotion, even like a repeated walking, could be simply formulated by passive walker, only the gravity actuation. However, when so we assume that this one turns out to be zero. However, it actually there are many multiple muscles that are involved to generate the multiple three-dimensional joints. So, for example, when their movements occur, there are biological motion sensors such as a vision, vestibular organ, and muscle spindles. The vision actually senses the our relative velocity of our body relative to the environment. So, head velocity, linear velocity, and angular velocities. And vestibular organ measures like a three-dimensional acceleration, head acceleration, and angular velocity. So it's like a IMU unit placed on each side of the ear, three axes. And also, even though we do, close our eyes and our head is stationary, we know where our bodies are located, where our limbs are located. So where are my elbows and knees, etc. So that's because our muscle itself, not only an actuation unit, it also has sensors that senses the muscle stretches, which is proportional to the joint angular motion. It should be omega here, joint angular motion and its rate. So you can think of this as biological encoder. Okay, so encoder at the joint, so that measures the joint position information, and those sensory signals are sent to the brain through the afferent nerve signal and collected at the cerebellum and cerebral cortex to integrate those multiple sensory information and figure that out our current body status and compare with our task desire. So by comparing those, the brain could generate the neuromuscular efferent signal to the muscle. So each muscle at each joints, like ankle, knee, and hip, or the other limbs, are contracting, and then to produce the forces and the torques, so that in turn develop the motion in terms of Newton's physics, the dynamics law, F equals ma. So this is a big cycle about how human movement has been generated, and the muscles are the results of neuromuscular control command from the brain, which is also based on the sensory measurement. So it's a pretty complicated one. So among those steps, like big sensory feedback steps from movement, sensory information, and the controls and actuation, in this chapter, we are going to specifically focus on how we can understand these torques in terms of muscle contraction. So for simple model, we just model the knee joint as a point, okay, massless leg and point, and then there's torques applied. But what really happens at the knee joint, for example, is like this much complicated. There are so many muscles are involved to actually make a motion for the knees. Okay, so those red part is a muscle and the white part is a tendon connecting the muscle to the bone. And there are some parts that connecting bone to bone directly without muscle. That's the ligament. Okay. So to generate, knee motion, like a rotational motion here, there are many muscles involved. So whenever those muscles actually generate the force, it actually generate the force through the contractions by shortening, that generates the forces. So there are many different forces applied, right? So for estimating the torques at the knee, we have to consider all the contribution by each forces. So the basic way is you can just multiply the moment arm cross product of forces. So you should figure that the moment arm of the knee. So where is the moment arm? This is not definitely a point rotational motion. So should I actually pick this one as a center of mass? You should actually trace the rotation of the knee joint using the equipment, optical monitoring equipment, and then should figure that out where is the true or nearest to true center of rotation, and then it's assumed to be somewhere here in the central point. So suppose this is the center of rotation, then what should you do is you should calculate the distance from the center to the muscle attachment point. So that's the moment arm for each muscle. So you should calculate the moment arm cross product F's to calculate the joint torques. So this is that complicated here. So far we just assume T, the net T, whatever comes in from many muscles, simply from inverse dynamics, but those T actually involved all this complicated muscles contribution summation. So next question is how we can then understand the muscle forces, how those are generated, what controls those length and the durations, etc. That's what we are going to study. And then basically this is based on the cross-bridge filament mechanism that physiologist has studied. And next thing is how we can then formulate them. So once we understand the mechanism, how we can formulate them to as a mathematical form so that we can implement it to our equations of motion. Okay, that's what we are going to do. So pretty much we are going to study about the famous, often frequently used Hill's model. And finally, how we can formulate them in terms of torques. The joint torques and joint muscle forces are related as a summation for the cross product, but also it's going to be a function of joint angles, etc. So how we can use those muscle force information to simulate or to generate the human motion and understand human motion dynamics. That's what we are going to work on in this chapter.